Hello, this is Paxton. I got another video for you. I'm currently in the same mission we were in before, but I've taken the player spawn function we made and deleted it and started over. This really isn't a what you would call player spawn script, but maybe for your mission it may work. I don't know, but this is just easiest place to throw this script in. There's a lot to explain in it. A lot of these things I didn't think were a big enough subject to put into one video, so I just put a lot of things in this one video here, and hopefully you can keep up. Hopefully I explain it well and don't go too fast. If you see at the top, it's good practice to get into. File name, description, parameters. You can see other functions that people have made that they do the same thing. Bohemia does the same thing. It's good practice, especially if you don't want to have to read a whole file to find out how it works. You can just look at the top, see the parameters you need, see what it does. It's good practice. Alright, at the top here I've got a scope name. I've got private, and it's an array of variables, which actually in quotes is actually strings. All this is doing, I'm going to do the scope name here in a second, but all this is doing is saying I want to keep all of these private variables private to this scope. I don't want another scope to come along and use these. I just want these to be available in this scope, which this doesn't really do much if there's not another scope inside the file. So I created another one. We will get to it. So going down, we got our parameters, which is player. I initialized some variables. One is markers, number of markers, which I actually don't use. But notice all these up here are my private scope. Then we get down here to something you haven't seen yet, which is a for loop. I believe there is 2 or 3 different syntaxes you can use for loops in Arma Scripting. This is the one I see used most often, and all it's saying is for this variable here, from 1 to 20, do this. From this bracket to this, just loop through this from 1 to 20, so do it 20 times. Why it starts with 4 doesn't really make sense with this syntax here, but the other syntax, it's a little easier to explain. You know, I'm not going to type it out. I'm not going to do all that. But all this is this is a variable that you can use inside the script, inside this loop, and it counts the number of iterations that has gone through. So it's going to start at 1 on its first trip through, and then 2, 3, 4, all the way up to 20. Which is good if you're working through an array. You can go through different elements of an array. Just like param 0, you can 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, all the way through. If you had an array that that may be different sizes every time you run the script, you don't know it's going to be 20. You can use count number of array, or you initialize up here and put number of markers in there. That way, if something changes sizes every time you run it, it's not hard coded in there. It's able to run with no problem. Especially if you put all the players in the server into an array and you loop through all the players in that array. This is one way you can do it without knowing, because it's going to change depending on how many people are connected to the server. You can see some commands I used. All these are on the wiki. All map markers, all it does is returns all the markers on the map, which currently, if you remember, I only have one marker, which is respawn_west for a respawn. So that array is only of one element. So if I were to put count markers here, it would just go through it one time and be done. Alright, and if you notice inside this loop I've changed the scope to marker making and marquee making. The reason I did that is, let's say if my player gets damage, I want to stop making markers. So I use a command called breakout of this scope, and then it will literally break out of it and go back to the main scope. Pretty simple. The wiki has an example of this. Look at breakout, type that in. Their example is a little more complicated. They have like several loops, and they break back to the previous loop and back to another one. And also you can return variables, or I don't know if you can do arrays, but I know you can return variables. So if you want to return 1 or 0, you can do that as well, but it would need to equal, or you need to call it or equal something so you can get that variable, and then you can use it in the previous, or the above scope. Hopefully I didn't lose you there. If I did, let me know and I'll try to explain a little better. But all it's doing is just breaking out of this loop, finishing it early, and going about its business. The easier way to do this would be like a while loop. While player damage is less than 20, do the loop. Don't even need to iterate 20 times. You just continuously go, but this way I have a limit of 20. You can't do it anymore. Alright, then here, this line, I'm creating a variable and using a command format. All this does is formats a string. Inside the array here, the first one is a string you're making, and the parentheses 1 is saying use this variable to attach to the string here. If you had multiple ones, let's say I had another variable a, and I could just do underscore %2, that would use the second parameter there, and 3, 4, 5, so forth. You can use as many as you need. As far as I know, there's sure there's a limit, but I don't know if we want to test that. So all I'm doing here is using our variable underscore I that we get from the for loop. So the first time it goes through this is going to be 1, because I started at 1, and it's going to be mrk1, marker 1, and it's going to assign that to a variable I named temp. Then we'll get my player's position, and the reason I need my player's position is because I'm passing it into an array here that is getting passed into a Bohemia Interactive Studios function that they've made, and returning and getting the return value of that function, which is called find safe position. If you look at the wiki, you can find this here. They don't give you the whole function, they just give you the top half of it like I made in my script. So all you gotta do is go through each line here, and you know exactly what you need to pass in: center position, and then so forth. I don't need to read all of it, but as you see down here, you get your optional ones. So you can exclude those, but you do have to include 0 to 6. And then it also tells you what it returns. It returns a position, and then they also add in some to-dos here where they need things they might want to go back and change, and then an example of how to use it. And there's a lot of functions. You can get a lot of them in the function viewer. Sorry about my clock in the background. In Arma, I'll show you that function viewer. You may have seen it already. But in the function viewer, you can actually see the code as well. Go ahead and open virtual reality here. And here's a function viewer. You got different things you can go through and see things they've created, and you can actually copy and paste this code over into yours and play around with it. And it's a good way to learn. You can just try to dissect it all and go through it all. All right, back to ours. As soon as I get my mouse back. So that's all I'm doing here. I'm using their function to find a safe position. And then I'm calling another command called create marker, which takes in a string and a position. Because anytime you create a marker, it's got to have a name. It's got to be a global name, so it can't be underscore. It's got to be a string like that without underscore, because it takes that and turns that into a global variable. Just like you're creating one in the editor, you have to have a name. If you don't put a name on it, it's going to name it for you. So instead of going through and hard coding or typing out marker 1, marker 2, if I say I wanted 500 markers, I don't want to sit there and type out 500 create marker lines. So this way I can just go through and make 20 markers and only type it one time, because I'm formatting the name of the marker here. And then I'm just making a dot. All I'm doing here is setting that marker type to h underscore dot. And I'm assigning underscore markers to all map markers, which I'm using the private here, so it actually does not change that array, my original array. And then I'm doing a for each loop, and I'm doing a little side chat for each marker in that array. I'm printing out in side chat. And then when this when this loop ends, or I get damage, it's going to run this and do a system chat and print out those markers, which is actually 1, because we only have one marker on the map. This marker was defined before we created these markers. Then I return true. That way, if you wanted to wait for this function to complete before you continued on, you can call this function and have it equal something. Like, you wouldn't do this in this script, obviously, but if you would do a equals you pass the player object in, that's the only parameter it takes. A equals spawn packs FNC player spawn. Oops. Spawn. A is not going to equal true until the script is completed. So you can do a wait until, if I could spell, wait until A equals true. And then that way, this script is going to not do anything until that's completed. If it never equals true, you got a problem. Then I need to delete that as well. Alright, so I think I pretty much covered everything. Let's see it in action. Hopefully, I'm afraid that I went through everything too fast, or I mumbled. I'm kind of tired, which I think I say that every video, but it is true. So let's go back here, check out the browser. And someone did mention that I could do some of these multiplayer things in the MP editor, or the regular Eden editor in the MP mode. Um, Most of these, yes, I could do there. It would work just fine. But just remember that the the server, this is a server here, is a dedicated server, is different from hosting a mission from your machine, from your client. Like if I went host server here and you play a mission, you're actually the server and a client on that mission. So everything that the init server runs, your client runs, and your player is going to have access to all those variables. Now, on a dedicated server, that's not the case. These are actually two different instances of the game running. The client here, and then the server here. So if you only script in the editor using MP mode, when you decide you want to run it on dedicated server, like through a host provider or on a different machine that just sits there and runs all day because you don't want to take the server down ever. You just want to keep it running, like a King of the Hill mission or something like that. You don't want to take it down. You need to leave it up. You can do that. But if you only edited in the MP editor, then send it to a dedicated server, you're probably going to have some problems, and it's not going to work as you intended it to. So I've just gotten in a habit of using a dedicated server all the time, but it's probably overkill. But I have spent a lot of time in the editor, and when I wanted to put something dedicated, I had to redo a lot of stuff, and it was very frustrating. Just give this a second to load. This is one thing I find interesting. To show you, I obviously don't know everything. I'm still learning, but it seems to run this loop one time and then stop, because I have a marker here. I've noticed this when I tested it, that it gives me one marker and then stops running. It almost seems that it goes through it and then stops, because it realizes that you're not playing yet. I haven't quite figured out why that happens. If that could be a problem of some scripts, possibly, or if it kind of pauses everything before you continue. I haven't quite decided that yet. But it's kind of good to know that it's going to run it. So you hit continue, and then you see the markers come up as I make a new it's going to go through the list every time a new marker is created, because the loop's running. It creates a marker, then it runs through a for each loop. So every time it hits that for each loop, there's another marker made. So if you go here, you can see them being made. Once it gets to the last one, there it is. Then it's going to start over again, and then go through the for each loop, which I'm sleeping 1 second, and then it's going to make another marker. If I didn't have that sleep in there, this would happen super fast. And then we'll go ahead and damage myself. The last for each loop, because it's got to make its way back around to the condition check with the if statement. And then it's going to break out and do our system chat there. We see it says respawn west, which was if you remember, that was a for each loop. So there's still only one marker in this array, even though this one had about 10 to the point where I damaged myself. I'm sorry, this one only has 1. This one had 10. It would have had up to 20 if I let it go, or 21 including the respawn west. But you can see this one was not changed because of this private markers here. That's it. Hope you learned something. Hope I didn't go too fast. If you need me to go more in depth in any of these subjects here, I will. But hopefully we got a lot covered today. Y'all have a great one.